hearing has now come to order. Good morning, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank all of our witnesses for coming here today, and of course our subcommittee members for being here and all of our staff. The topic of this hearing, the growth of global space capabilities, what's happening and why it matters, is one that should concern all members of the subcommittee, but also all members of Congress as well. Because the world is changing, and those changes present both opportunities and, frankly, some very serious challenge to the United States that we cannot ignore. And today we're going to hopefully get to the bottom of some of those opportunities and challenges. While I believe this hearing is particularly timely in light of the President traveling to China, Japan, and other nations in the Asia region, there is another reason why we decided to hold this hearing at this time. We are at a critical juncture, and decisions are being contemplated that will have a significant impact on both the direction and the health of our nation's civil space program for decades to come. While the President and his advisors are engaged in their internal deliberations on what to recommend for NASA and its human spaceflight program, we believe it's imperative not for Congress to stand by idly. Instead, I believe that Congress must use the time remaining in the session to carry out the independent oversight necessary to oversee and assess the findings of the Augustine panel, and more importantly, to illuminate the stakes that are involved in whatever decision the White House and Congress makes regarding NASA's funding and future direction. We started that oversight process, you'll remember, in September with a review of the totality of the Augustine report. We followed that full committee hearing with a subcommittee hearing to review what needs to be done to improve the effectiveness of NASA's technology programs, an issue raised by the Augustine panel. Schedule permitting, I intend to follow today's hearing with a hearing to examine human spaceflight safety issues, an area that many believe was given inadequate scrutiny by the Augustine report, and then a hearing to examine workforce and industrial base issues that are inextricably linked to the decisions we make about NASA's future. As I mentioned earlier, our hearing this morning focuses on the growth of global space capabilities that have significant implications to the United States as we contemplate the future of our own spaceflight program. As our witnesses will make clear, at a time when some in the United States seem to be questioning whether we should sustain a strong commitment to investing in our space program, the rest of the world has not hesitated to embrace the promise that the exploration and the utilization of outer space can offer to them. Those other nations recognize that space activities can spur innovation, help improve the quality of life of their citizens, promote national security and economic competitiveness, and advance geopolitical objectives. That recognition echoes the aspirations of our congressional predecessors, many whose portraits we see here today, when they first established NASA and undertook other related activities some 50 years ago. While the Sputnik moment delivered by the Soviet Union in 1957 and the subsequent space race helped catalyze action by the United States government, it was not just geopolitical competition that drove us to invest in our U.S. space program. Important as the Cold War rivalry was, I believe that even then, visionaries in the Congress and the executive branch recognized the benefits to our society and our country that a strong and robust space program could deliver to the United States. History has proved them right. Here we are today. We can look at the myriad of ways that our space investments have transformed our economy, our defense, and our quality of life for the last 50 years to realize that space has become woven into the very fabric of all of our daily lives. So it's no surprise that other nations, seeing the benefits of space investments, have delivered to our nation. They want to share in those benefits as well. And I, for one, see that as a positive development and not one to fear. While we must always be vigilant against those who would use space capabilities to threaten others, we should not turn away from opportunities for constructive engagement in peaceful space cooperation. Because, as our witnesses make clear, there are no lack of challenges that would benefit from cooperation among nations in the space arena. That, of course, was expressed by President Kennedy almost 50 years ago. He said, "This generation does not intend to founder in the backwash of the coming age of space. We mean to be a part of it. We mean to lead it." We faced, of course, different challenges than one that was faced by President Kennedy and folks that come before us in the Congress. But it was really that vision of the importance of space and the future to this country, and the importance generally of overall U.S. leadership in exploring and utilizing space that has been borne out over the intervening years. It's clear that the space capabilities that have been created around the world can play a constructive and a significant role in addressing the many societal challenges we face today. But it's also clear that our next great space endeavor, that of human and robotic exploration of our solar system, can benefit greatly from those same global space capabilities. Yet, if we are to harness those capabilities, the United States needs to make clear to the rest of the world that we are not wavering. We are not wavering in our own commitment to space exploration and to the path that we started down. Of course, it's hard to lead without a clear sense of direction. Fortunately, this Congress has a sense of direction. The NASA Authorization Act of 2008 established a congressional consensus in support of a strong human and robotic exploration initiative as part of a robust and balanced space program and in support of devoting the resources needed to pay for it. I know the President is currently grappling with many hard decisions in the days ahead as he attempts to balance competing priorities. But what to do about the nation's space program doesn't have to be one of them. Based on the actions already taken by Congress over the last 4 years, I think there's a clear path ahead that already has broad congressional support, and I'm confident that he will support it too. With that, again, I thank you, I welcome our witnesses, and now we will hear from Mr. Olson.
Madam Chairwoman, thank you for calling this morning's hearing to examine the efforts and goals of countries around the world that have recognized the importance of space capabilities to their respective nations. Understanding their objectives and how the United States can work with them directly and indirectly to achieve common goals must be an aspect of our own nation's space program. Let me begin by thanking our witnesses for their appearance here today. I recognize that each of you has spent considerable time and effort preparing for this hearing, and in some cases, traveling a considerable distance to be here. Please know that this subcommittee appreciates your efforts, as well as the wisdom and experience you bring, and that we will refer to your guidance in the months and years ahead. As has been well documented, the space age was born out of international cooperation, came of age during a time of international competition, and now is maturing under a period of both. How we progress going forward has global implications beyond what we witnessed in the Cold War. We see nation after nation recognize that space-based capabilities are beneficial in the areas of disaster relief, broadband deployment, telemedicine, agriculture, training and education, and climate monitoring, just to name a very few. As interested as I am to hear what other countries are doing and how they're investing their resources, I want to not lose sight of how those efforts should impact the United States of America. I'm all for talking about global partnerships, but we should never, ever cede American leadership in endeavors we have earned and invested in for several decades now. In the area of human spaceflight in particular, the activity of other nations is extremely telling. With each nation that commits to the goal of sending humans into orbit, and with each promise of missions to the moon, both manned and unmanned, we should recommit ourselves to an unequivocal path of human spaceflight that serves as an example of leadership and potential partnership for other nations. Continuously since 2000, the International Space Station has orbited the Earth as an example of how nations can work together to achieve great goals. The engineering, scientific, and diplomatic achievements of this lab should be an example of the type of partnership we can achieve going forward. In an area of limited economic resources, particularly in our nation, we must find creative solutions to fund worthy enterprises. We spent a lot of time in this room talking about the benefits of space-based technologies, industries, and exploration. And it's critical to convey that those benefits are not limited to the United States, but that the impact is global. After all, satellites don't just orbit America. Whether the efforts are better to understand our climate, to help people recover from natural disasters, or to connect economies around the globe, we can look to space to help make our world a better place. When that is the goal we're discussing, it is more than worth the time of this committee and our witnesses, again, for sharing your insights with us. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Olson. If there are members who wish to submit additional opening statements, your statements will be added to the record at this point. Today we have a distinguished set of witnesses, but we also have a new member of Congress, John Garamendi, who's sitting in the audience. He's from California. John, where are you? Congressman? Good to see you. Welcome. We're excited about having you in our committee, and we just want to we want to welcome you and make sure you're feeling at home here. Okay, this is great. Okay, let's take a moment to introduce our witnesses. First up, we have Dr. Marty Hauser, who is the Vice President of Research and Analysis for the Washington operations of the Space Foundation. As someone who played a key role in the Space Report 2009, he's well positioned to talk about the status of global space capabilities and the global space economy. Next up, we're going to hear from Mr. J.P. Stevens, who is a Vice President for Space Systems at the Aerospace Industries Association. He's going to provide for us a perspective on the emerging global space environment and the implications for the U.S. aerospace industry and its workforce. We're also going to hear this morning from Dr. Pace, Dr. Scott Pace, who's the Director of the Space Policy Institute at the George Washington University. He's going to provide some insights on what's growing in terms of global space capabilities, what that means for the United States leadership, and associated policies that we will need to confront. Also, we're going to hear from Dr. Kai-Uwe Schrogl, who is the Director of the European Space Policy Institute. He has agreed to provide a European perspective on the impact and implications of growing space capabilities, and we're pleased to have that foreign perspective this morning. So good morning. And finally, we have Dr. Ray Williamson, who is the Executive Director of the Secure World Foundation. Dr. Williamson will provide perspectives on the capabilities of emerging space nations and as well some of the issues that we're going to need to consider when engaging with them. As all our witnesses know, you'll each have 5 minutes for your spoken testimony. I know that's not a very long period of time, but I know we're going to have some really good questions and discussion a little bit later. Your written testimony will be included in the record for the hearing, and when you've completed your spoken testimony, will be good in questions. And of course, each member will have 5 questions. So, Mr. Hauser, we're going to start with you.
Thank you. Good morning, Chairwoman Giffords, Ranking Member Olson, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I'm Marty Hauser, and I'm Vice President of Washington Operations, Research and Analysis at the Space Foundation. On behalf of our Board of Directors and our CEO, it's a pleasure to be here today, and I want to thank you for holding this event. Space age is now more than 50 years old and has given birth to a global industry valued at more than $257 billion. As you know, what was once the province of only the United States and the former Soviet Union is now a dramatically growing industry. Many of our allies are catching up, and they're catching up fast. They have developed their nascent space capabilities and are modestly and steadily investing in their own space capabilities. The trend we all know is that the U.S. leadership in space is eroding on multiple fronts, and legislative, policy, and fiscal redirections are all critical. Most any space capability we have in the United States now exists in other nations. The quality may vary, and no other country currently can do what we do, but the number of countries' capabilities are growing and again growing steadily. Lots of countries now have active space programs, even countries at the low and middle income levels. The fact is that more than 60 countries now have a space agency. This is a significant trend, as it wasn't half that large just a few years ago. That said, with all of these nations so active in space, it is increasing opportunities for more international collaboration. Benefits can be found. Another trend is an increasing willingness to share knowledge and expertise about space. An example is China agreeing to build and launch satellites for Nigeria and Venezuela. They also train the staff in those countries how to operate those systems. Established space companies are also involved in training. The European company EADS is partnering with Kazakhstan to build satellites, operate a satellite integration center, and train Kazakh engineers. This is difficult for American firms to do because of ITAR restrictions. We also can't underestimate these countries either. Europe, Japan, Russia, India, and China have first-rate launch capabilities. Japan, China, and India all have programs today that include lunar exploration. This past September, Space Foundation delegation visited China, toured a number of previously classified facilities. While I was not on that trip, I was told it was quite stunning. The facilities are state-of-the-art. Another member also went to French Guiana on a trip and came back saying, it's a launch site that can teach us many things about how to improve our launch infrastructure. He also noted that the large numbers of young men and women doing engineering and technical work that we need to better engage young Americans and that we need to encourage them to work in America's space program. We are losing our competitive position in some of the most critical disciplines such as launch, manufacturing, and services. We must work harder to preserve and retain strategic, technical, and commercial advantages to remain the market leader in any global technology field. In some cases, international capabilities provide opportunities for us in terms of technology exchange, exports, outcomes through direct foreign investment. In other instances, the international capabilities may be competitive in nature and may reduce U.S. capability and economic opportunity over long term. It can also create rivals, and I doubt that any of us want to hear about a Soviet-Chinese relationship and cooperation that goes on without involving the United States. From a purely pragmatic point of view, space is crowded, and we need to reduce the debris that is up there because the potential for satellite collisions is great. Historically, the United States has held the position of space superiority. This means we have a more favorable position than most other nations in space. However, this space superiority is sliding quickly towards parity. A few quick examples. The Russians lead the world in space launch over the past 5 years, and they intend to increase that dramatically. While Russia and the United States provide the most orbital launches from year to year, 2007, 2008, the share of non-U.S. Russian launches grew from 34 to 41%. I don't envy your task, but I agree with much of what you both said in your opening statements. So for me, this is my personal view because it comes down to one simple question. Does the United States want to continue to be the leader in space? If the answer is no, then we are already living our future. If the answer is yes, however, we must remember that our leadership position in space is not a birthright. Over the past 50 years, we have had to make bold decisions and earn that leadership position. To continue being the global space leader, we must bite the financial bullet, roll up our sleeves, and get to work. We apply our great minds and our great talent, find better and smarter ways. We make the trade-offs to do what is necessary to get to and work in space. We build international partnerships and share costs where no one else can. We stand up and we lead the way we always have. We innovate, we educate, we produce, and we lead. Space is an enabler for people around the world and a multitude of industries that can better our world. But to better our world, we must first, as a United States, once again enable space. Thank you for your time. I'm prepared to answer your questions later.
Thank you, Mr. Hauser. Mr. Stevens.
Good morning, Chairwoman Giffords, Ranking Member Olson, members of the committee. I'm grateful to be here to testify before you today. The Aerospace Industries Association is the largest aerospace trade association in the United States, and we have about 300 members, and we represent over 640,000 high-wage workers that indirectly support another 2 million workers, 30,000 suppliers in all 50 states. We appreciate the efforts of Congress to keep both our civil and national security programs healthy. Numerous commercial interests such as banking transitions, business and personal communications, all depend on communications and GPS satellites. Essential national security information and all of our military operations depend on space assets. And weather and climate satellites give us life-saving warnings and information on climate change. Now, for many years, the benefits of space programs were provided primarily by the United States and Russia. But our lead was achieved because space was given a Cold War priority as far as funding, but funding is no longer at the level it was back then. Now, other nations with the proper workforce and foresight to make the necessary investments have rapidly caught up to us. Allow me just quickly to mention a few areas where I believe the U.S. has either lost or is losing its leadership in space, and that includes satellites, human spaceflight, and launch systems. As you're well aware, satellites are employed and built by a number of nations. However, because of export control restrictions, many countries are building and employing satellites and advertising them as ITAR-free. This is not good for our companies when our share of the world market now is only 29%. Global positioning system satellites are used by our airlines, our emergency responders, and others, and they also provide exact timing, which is critical to both the financial and banking industry. Of the $144 billion that is generated worldwide by satellite revenues, roughly $23 billion come out of our system, our GPS system. However, other nations are developing their own. Russia is about to launch 6 more satellites and will have their system completed by March. The Europeans and Chinese are working on theirs, and they'll have their systems completed sometime between 2014 and 2017. And India and Japan are developing their own systems. New global navigation satellite systems compete with our system, but most importantly, they raise the issues of compatibility and interoperability, not only between the systems, but also to the systems they support. In regard to human spaceflight, the Chinese orbited an astronaut, as you're well aware, for a day in 2003, and since then they have made significant milestones. They have had multiple crews, orbital maneuvers, and spacewalks. The thing to remember here is that they're on the same pace as we were during the moon race with the Russians, but most importantly, they're doing it with far fewer flights. The Europeans and Japanese have flown cargo vessels to the International Space Station, and the Europeans are now talking about taking that cargo section of their spacecraft and adding a human-rated capsule. India is planning to set up astronaut training in 2012 and hope to have their first astronaut in space by 2015. Another area of concern for us is the U.S. commercial space launch industry, which now only has about 15% of the global market. Now, why is all this important to Congress? Well, space is an excellent technology driver, and military and programs enable early human spaceflight. Recall John Glenn, my former boss, and Yuri Gagarin were both launched on military ICBMs. Well, the reverse is also true. These countries that are getting into the space race now can enable their space capabilities into military capabilities. So what can you do? Well, the first thing we need from you is your commitment to maintain space leadership. To do this, we need stable and robust funding. Space programs take time to develop, test, and build. Fluctuating budgets and delayed programs take their toll on agencies like NASA. We need your leadership to support space being treated as a singular enterprise, where all the decisions and strategies of all the agencies that deal with space are coordinated at a White House level. We need your support with our future workforce. Currently, we graduate only 74,000 engineers a year, and out of that, many of them are foreign nationals that return to their countries to work on things like ITAR-free satellites. And so that ends up leaving us about 60,000, and you compare that with China and India that basically graduate hundreds of thousands each year. Space systems are also produced in small numbers. So interruptions or cancellations negatively impact our big companies, but they can be catastrophic to the small suppliers that often produce the small but critical components on which huge portions of our economy, infrastructure, and national security depend. I agree with you, Chairwoman, that as a nation we need to consider international partnerships, but I will say cooperation needs to be equitable with our partners and not adversely impact our industrial base or our national security. I think a good example of this is the International Space Station, and I believe that the International Space Station should be funded and flown until at least 2020. In conclusion, our space technologies have become an important part of our nation's economic and national security capabilities. But our leadership in space and everything that space supports is no longer guaranteed. I thank the committee for their time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Stevens. Dr. Pace.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and Ranking Member Olson, for providing this opportunity to talk about this important topic. And I particularly commend the international orientation that you decided to take on this, because I think this goes to the heart of the geopolitical significance of space that often isn't recognized. The geosynchronous arc is crowded with communication satellites. As you've heard, Russia, Europe, Japan, China, India are modernizing or building their own satellite-based navigation systems. The UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space is larger than ever, with 69 member states. In some cases, developments are cause for congratulations, as is, I believe, the case when China became the third country to independently conduct a spacewalk. In others, these developments are a cause for concern, as the case of North Korean and Iranian missile programs. Last month, I attended an annual meeting of the International Astronautical Federation in Daejeon, South Korea. There is a statue of South Korea's first astronaut on the main boulevard. The President of South Korea spoke at the opening ceremony and said, "Space technology is already being applied in various areas of our daily lives. Space technology is the growth engine that will open the future of mankind and has become a necessary tool of our own survival." Representatives from Europe, Japan, Russia, China, India, and Korea presented their increasingly specific plans for explorations of the Moon and missions to Mars. NASA also presented current U.S. plans, and images of hardware being built and tested, I have to say, were quite impressive. Just as impressive was the expressed spirit of international cooperation and coordination, not only among International Space Station partners, but rapidly rising powers such as India, China, and Korea. And this spirit has been in development, not overnight, but over the last 3 years as a part of an inclusive U.S. diplomatic strategy that resulted in 14 space agencies agreeing to a common global exploration strategy. Unfortunately, ongoing U.S. debates, combined with the realities of the fiscal year 2010 NASA budget, have created an air of uncertainty over U.S. intentions. And to borrow from Norm Augenstein, it's hard to get others to work on your garden if you're pulling up the flowers to check the roots. So the U.S. is a founding member of the Space Club, as you've heard, but we're at the risk of shifting to an emeritus status. The Chinese in particular have laid out a careful, logical approach in which they plan to launch a mission in 2011 to test docking and rendezvous techniques, followed by a man-tended laboratory in 2015, and a 3-man space station by 2020. Interesting date. The selection of 45 new taikonauts is underway, along with plans for a lunar sample return and a Mars orbiter. Now, I have to say I welcome peaceful Chinese space exploration efforts. However, I don't want to see them or other nations to be on the frontier of space without us. If we are not planning for what comes after the ISS, the government is, in effect, getting out of the human spaceflight business. There may be space tourists launched by U.S. companies, and I certainly hope so. But tourism alone cannot sustain a major international cooperative human spaceflight effort. If we are not going beyond low Earth orbit, we are ignoring both the recommendations of the Columbia Accident Investigation Board and the reality of the increasing globalization of space activity. For India, ambitious space efforts are to attract new human capital to a strategic aerospace sector, which must compete with a growing information technology sector. For China, human spaceflight experiences are training a new generation of technical specialists and raising the quality level of industrial suppliers. For Japan and Europe, spaceflight demands are creating interdisciplinary skills that can increase the competitiveness of their aerospace and their non-aerospace sectors. The sophisticated system engineering demanded by human spaceflight is part and parcel of what a great nation does, and most importantly, a symbol of what it is capable of doing. Human spaceflight is the most demanding space activity technically, financially, and organizationally. From the beginning, it has also been a most symbolic activity, both at home and abroad. A powerful symbol of cooperation among former adversaries, such as on the International Space Station, and the deep international relationships built through the ISS are among its most impressive and perhaps most enduring achievements to date. For the future, we need to continue effort to bind friends and allies to us in a multi-partner world in which space capabilities are globalized. We need friends and allies to secure the global commons of space upon which we all depend. We need to inspire a new generation of Americans to take on many demands in a globally competitive environment driven by scientific and technical innovation. The international norms for human space activity will be shaped by those who are there, not by those who stay behind. If we want to see a human future in space that reflects our values, then we must be a part of that effort. The NASA Authorization Acts of 2005 and 2008, as mentioned, combined with the global exploration strategy that was developed with U.S. participation, provides, in my view, a clear and practical way forward for this nation. I hope the Administration and Congress will support the restoration of necessary NASA funds for exploration in carrying out those directions. The U.S. is facing a generational transition away from the period represented by the Space Shuttle and is just as profound as the transition from Apollo was. The nation will need to compete and cooperate in space as never before. The transition is upon us now, at home and abroad. Just as we see that others are not delaying their entries into space, the question before this House will be, what will this nation do? Thank you for your attention. I would be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you, Dr. Pace. Dr. Schrogl.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman, Ranking Member, members of the Subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear today. In this intervention, I would like to provide European perspectives on the implications of the growth of global spacefaring capabilities and to point out some implications of these current trends for the transatlantic relations. The European Space Policy Institute, ESPI, is the central European think tank for space policy, created following a decision by the member states of the European Space Agency, ESA, and established as an independent institution in Vienna, Austria. ESPI prepares analysis and conducts activities addressed to policymakers in Europe with the aim of facilitating the decision-making processes in the field of space policy. Madam Chairwoman, in addressing the first issue, the European perspectives on the implications of the growth of global spacefaring capabilities, it should be pointed out that Europe regards this trend as basically positive, but also identifies numerous threats. The opportunities are twofold. A rising number of spacefaring countries and the broadening of space programs and missions can be beneficial for supporting joint efforts for dealing with global problems. Two examples are global climate change monitoring and disaster management and mitigation. In both cases, the number of coordinated satellite missions cannot be large enough in order to achieve the highest impact possible. A second area of opportunities lies in the possibility to develop markets for space-related products and services on an international and global scale. Threats, however, can be seen in the proliferation of critical technologies or in the field of lacking regulations in emerging spacefaring countries, leading to flags of convenience and distorting fair international competition. Europe also understands that it can lose international prestige if it is passed by space powers like China or India, which would have consequences for the attractiveness of Europe as a high-tech technology partner. But this consequence should only encourage Europe to further increase its own efforts. Now, Madam Chairwoman, the consequences of these trends for the transatlantic relations can be set out as three categories. A promising field, which is cooperation in the field of space for security. A necessary field, which is space as a strategic economic issue area and a tool to deal with climate change. And the third, a potential field, which is space exploration. In our view, the most promising field for transatlantic cooperation today is space for security. Space situational awareness should be addressed and organized in a cooperative way between the United States and Europe. The European Draft Code of Conduct for Outer Space Activities is the first major European diplomatic initiative in this field and should be actively supported by the US since it matches completely its interests. Other areas for cooperation could be space for internal security or homeland security, maritime security, and responsive space where both the US and Europe could benefit from closer cooperation. In addition to that, the US could consider benefiting from recent technology developments made in Europe, for example, in the field of radar technology. A necessary field, the second one I want to mention, for transatlantic cooperation is the coordination in issues related to space as a strategic economic area. ESPI has recently published a joint memorandum with the Space Policy Institute led by Dr. Pace, identifying numerous actions. Amongst them are the protection of the radio frequency spectrum for space services, the promotion of open, interoperable standards, and the promotion of open international markets in space goods and services, as well as closer international consultations on the development or modification of domestic regulations. The US and Europe should also jointly lead efforts in using space for tackling the global problems, as I mentioned, climate change. Before that background, space exploration, while leading the debate today, can only be regarded as a potential field of transatlantic cooperation. While first deliberations have been made now, the priority has to be the full and successful use of the International Space Station as the basis for an international space exploration program. In summarizing, I first of all would like to point out that the transatlantic relations should receive your high attention, since they are crucial in organizing the most important aspects of space activities, which are space for security and space as a strategic economic field. Dialogue and partnership in this field with the European Union and the European Space Agency, as well as the European Parliaments, should be intensified and institutionally strengthened. The single issues I have mentioned in these areas require roadmaps for implementing joint activities. This might be reflected in the ongoing space policy review in the US, and a strong US-European partnership can certainly strengthen security and successfully tackle global challenges. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much. Last, we're going to hear from Dr. Williamson.
Chairwoman Giffords, Ranking Member Olson, and distinguished members of this subcommittee, I am pleased to have this opportunity to share with you Secure World Foundation's insights on the growth in world space capabilities and why these changes are important to U.S. interests. One of the most important characteristics of the past decade is the rapid emergence of new actors in outer space. Since 1999, the number of states with space systems in orbit has increased from 27 to 37. Countries as diverse as Algeria, Iran, Nigeria, Venezuela, South Africa, and Turkey have now become part of the so-called Space Club. The addition to the space environment of new players and spacecraft raises both opportunities and challenges for the governance of space activities, as you mentioned, Chairwoman Giffords. It also means a larger marketplace for U.S. products. Finally, it raises the important challenge that every spacefaring state wants to own its own Earth observation and communication satellite, leading to crowding in key orbits. This and the growth of space debris increases the need to establish effective governance of the global commons of outer space and raises the following concerns for the United States. Have the emerging space states instituted best operational practices in designing and operating their launch systems and spacecraft? Have they signed and ratified the 1967 Treaty on Outer Space and the other space agreements? Do they adhere to the United Nations orbital debris guidelines? In the view of the Foundation, the United States can improve its own orbital security for commerce, science, and national security, and gain closer allies by engaging with the emerging space states in two key areas. First, assisting emerging spacefaring countries to adhere to international best practices in space activities. Guaranteeing the long-term sustainability of outer space is one of the most important space issues the United States will face over the next decade. It is therefore important to assist emerging states to develop clear policies and laws that conform with international norms. This February, the UN Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space will begin work on a set of so-called best practices for space activities. The United States can continue to play a significant role in COPUOS by engaging with the small states as well as the larger ones in defining best practices. Second, is taking greater advantages of the opportunities that the emergence of these new space states present for U.S. policymaking. The space arena can provide a powerful platform for engaging in what has been called soft power, the use of U.S. technological and economic capabilities and policies to influence policymakers in other countries. Through NASA, the U.S. Geological Survey, and NOAA, the United States has long engaged with Latin America in space science and applications. It may be time to increase that engagement, in part to counterbalance the growing influence of China in the region. China has taken a strong interest in Latin America and has actively assisted both Brazil and Venezuela in their space efforts. China and Brazil jointly developed and operate the CBERS Earth Resources Satellite System. Just a year ago, China launched into orbit a Chinese communications satellite that it sold to Venezuela under a technology transfer agreement. Some 90 Venezuelan engineers and technicians traveled to China to help build and launch the satellite. Satellite Simon Bolivar now provides communications for most of Latin America and has enabled Venezuela to extend its influence throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. The United States could extend its own engagement with Latin America through additional teaching and cooperative space science and applications programs. However, the current onerous ITAR regulations impede our ability to cooperate effectively with space countries. ITAR reform would go a long way to fix this impediment. We need a regulatory framework that assists, not impedes, the creation of new markets and enhances international cooperation and competition. We at Secure World Foundation mostly see space developments among emerging space states as opportunities rather than as threats. In general, the United States can bolster the long-term security climate in space by working with these states to build space capacity, especially in space science and applications where current ITAR regulations are not large issues. Enhanced ability to make use of the benefits that space systems provide means a broader market for U.S. goods and services, especially high-tech consumer items. Just as important, however, is the need to assist emerging space states to develop space policies with a global long-term sustainable approach. The U.S. range of policies, legal instruments, and interagency practices can be instructive to emerging space states that are just developing their own space-related policies and law. Countries that gain an economic and political stake in the space environment are more likely to pitch in to preserve the space environment for the future. Finally, these reflections lead to the overall need for the United States to develop an overarching space strategy that includes military, civil, and commercial, and international components. Such a strategy would go a long way to clarify the direction of U.S. investments in space and the nature and scope of U.S. involvement in the international community.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williamson, and to all of our panelists today. I mean, you really brought forward some fascinating aspects of this very complex situation. At this point, we're going to begin our first round of questions. The chair recognizes herself for 5 minutes. I think a couple of points were clear across all of our witnesses. One is that the space environment globally is changing, that we've seen tremendous amount of developments in the last 50 years, but particularly in the last decade. Also that U.S. leadership is in question, and the lack of commitment that we've seen here in the United States and the world has seen, it really changes the perspective of this economic, this defense aspect, exploration aspect, technological aspect that space brings with it. So my question, and I'm going to begin with Dr. Pace, is a bit of a twist. You talked about your international experience, and I'm interested in hear from others as well. But what does this non-direct, clear vision for the United States mean to other countries? Without a clear, precise vision for where we are going in space at this moment, how does that change other nations' commitment? I mean, without having a U.S. strong lack of commitment to space.
Well, I think that it makes it difficult for advocates in other countries who want to work with us to make an argument that they'll, in fact, be a partner. It also increases desires to look for other partners and alliances with other rising partners to make different arrangements as they pursue their own self-interest. As I said, the global exploration strategy is one which is a very collaborative effort. It is not a situation where the U.S. says we need to define everything and then you get to fit in various places. The global exploration strategy is one which has been very inclusive to have other countries involved in defining the architecture and working together in a way that really I think is unprecedented. But if the U.S. appears not to be there or to be uncertain to be there, then what is there to talk about? And therefore people start looking at each other and going, maybe we should be making other arrangements because we just don't know if the Americans are going to be there. As a result, it is not as if people are being hostile or anything to the United States. It is simply that we are making ourselves irrelevant to the discussions. And if we become irrelevant, then I think that does harm our interests as people will pursue their own self-interests in economic and commercial and international and security interests.
Thank you. Dr. Schrogl?
Yes. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. The United States is still spending so much more money than all the other spacefaring countries that U.S. leadership is present in your capabilities and in the activities you are conducting in outer space. The United States is leading through this engagement, and as I pointed out in my statement, Europe is very much interested in a strong relationship with the United States. The European countries have recently started to come up with diplomatic initiatives of their own, and we regard this as an opportunity to jointly develop issues in outer space where the United States could have taken leadership, but where we, as the Europeans, have waited for such initiatives. We have seen a number of areas where Europe started debates, like on space debris and now on safe conduct of space activities, where it is absolutely necessary, of course, that the United States engages actively in such debates. And we have seen that the United States is ready to cooperate in such fields with Europe in order to come up with joint global visions in these fields. So the United States certainly has to take an active role in the international field, you can do that. And Europe is certainly ready to work very closely with the United States in order to achieve common objectives.
Yeah. Thank you. I have more questions, but we have so many members. I think that we want to make sure with votes and everything we get everyone's question in. So let me stop there and turn the floor over to Mr. Olson.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. Thank you for your kindness. And gentlemen, I will be brief to make sure that all the members get to ask their questions. I want to talk about collaborations and specialization. Going forward, exploration of space beyond low Earth orbit, either robotically or by human presence, will most likely be done collaboratively between two or more nations. By limiting the role each partner might play in a future mission, does this necessarily mean that as nations become specialized in one of several capabilities, they give up the capability of maintaining a full suite of capabilities? And is it necessarily bad if a nation decides to cede a set of capabilities to another nation? Too much over-specialization. Mr. Hauser, you're on the left.
That's a tough one. I think it depends on the nation's perspective and what they want to achieve and what their goals are for their own space program. You know, if you're a smaller country and you don't have the financial wherewithal to do, then maybe it gives you an opportunity to play where you might not have been able to play before. If you have grandiose dreams, then maybe over-specifying is a little bit too difficult. I would defer to my colleagues who probably know more specifics about each of the nations, but I really, it does come down to the objectives of that nation and to their own psyche about what they want to achieve for their country and the status that they want their country to be perceived at. So I think it really comes down to them and what they want to do.
Thank you for the answer. Mr. Stevens?
I would tend to agree with what Marty said, and I would just add that I think for the United States, though, it's a totally different issue. I think we need to be capable in all areas of space we are now, and we should continue to be that way. It's, I think it would be unsatisfactory for us to totally turn over one capability to another nation.
Thank you very much. That's exactly what I was looking for. Appreciate that. Dr. Pace.
I think keying off that, the capabilities that we have should be commensurate with what our responsibilities are. A relatively smaller country or regional power may want to have space capabilities that are appropriate for it. If we want to see ourselves as a global power and global influence, then we need to have a full suite of those capabilities. So capabilities reflect what we think our role in the world is. And I think that, as my colleague mentioned about strategic economic issues, if we're going to be cooperating with other countries, part of what we should be doing is being able to shape the ability of those countries to make it easier for them to work with us. So that's why we talk about open international standards, open markets. We protect the radio frequency spectrum. We talk about global commons. Just as we are a maritime nation, we are a space nation. And therefore, things that are part of that space commons are of deep interest to us. I don't think there is a capability that we should unilaterally cede to depend on others, because I don't think there's an aspect of our national security and foreign policy that we would want to cede to others. But at the same time, we should make it easier for others to work with us, both by being a stable and trusted partner and making sure that our standards and markets are open to that cooperation.
And just to follow up on your comments there, do you think that by deorbiting the International Space Station in 2015 that we sort of violate that promise and those promises we made to those countries and hurt our standing globally?
I think that the problem with the 2015 date, and I agree with what's been said, that I think it should be at least be sustained through 2020 so that we can make a data-driven, data-based decision on whether to continue it or not. I mean, the experiment has been set up, but the experiment has not yet run. So we should see whether we get value out of it. As I've said, I think the international collaboration we've achieved so far is already an outstanding value and a creation that is very impressive. Now we need to run the science experiments, see how that works, and then we can make a decision based upon real data and real results. And so I think it would be wrong to preemptively deorbit that station. And if I might say, what I would have preferred is that we may have put something in the budget that said we're either going to deorbit it or we're going to extend it, and not have left it ambiguous the way we did. But nonetheless, that's the decision now before this administration.
Yes, sir, agreed on that comment as well. Dr. Schrogl?
Yes. Thank you. We in Europe, we are used to the fact that our smaller countries are not able to cover the whole range of space activities. So we are used to cooperation in the European framework in order to achieve common objectives and then try to cover the whole field. Europe and other countries, spacefaring countries, are certainly very much interested in getting into the position to have autonomous capabilities in various areas, be it space transportation, be it now global navigation services. And as I said, it is or it will be extremely important in the future that these systems will be combined and coordinated into systems of systems in order to achieve common goals like global change, where we simply cannot have enough systems around the Earth in order to achieve these common objectives.
Thank you, Dr. Schrogl. And Dr. Williamson?
It seems to me it's not just a matter of which technologies to focus on and so forth, but what the capabilities you want are. And in my view, the United States should maintain a full range of technological capabilities, but it may be, for example, that we depend on another country more for certain areas rather than others in order to achieve a greater common good for the international community. So it's a question of how taking leadership to determine how we can best use the capabilities of others to achieve our goals as well as contribute to theirs.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much for the answer, and I'm over my time. Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Thank you, Mr. Olson. We're going to hear from Representative Cosmas next.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Thank you all, gentlemen, for being here this morning. It's been quite enlightening to hear from you, and I think encouraging as well for us to understand the significance of the opportunities before us to cooperate internationally in space exploration. However, I suspect that you feel the angst that we as members of this committee have and as representatives of communities that depend on space and consider it to be a very, very important issue for our nation, both in national security as well as in advancements of science and technology. I guess I would say ambiguous, I think was a word just used, as to where are we headed. And I guess my question is that what do you sense? Some of you have made rather blunt assessments as to the aggressive way in which other countries are seeking to do the things that we have always considered our primary territory and our ability to continue to be a leader in space exploration. What do you consider to be the greatest impediment that we are hindered, by which we are hindered at the moment in terms of our ability to continue to be leaders in space exploration and specifically manned space exploration? Mr. Hauser?
I keep having to go first here. Finance is certainly one of the biggest impediments. You know, as we've discussed already here, it's very difficult not only for us to plan with our budgets, but then for other countries to depend on us and to engage in partnerships and cooperative efforts if they don't have a reasonable comfortability that we are going to continue to be there as we go through that process. There are probably some regulatory issues as well. It is also a great impediment and certainly hurting our own marketplace because of the ITAR restrictions, and in many ways we've been our own worst enemy. I'm a retired Air Force colonel, so I certainly believe in protecting national security, but you know, you have to protect what's important, but you also have to find ways to work in the environment so that you're not so restrictive that you create other markets and other opportunities for everybody else, which I personally believe we have, so we need to balance that out. I think those are the two big ones that really come to my mind.
Mr. Stevens?
Well, once again, Marty took my two things, but I'd like to add to the biggest concern I think we have is ITAR, and it really affects companies that we represent, especially the small ones. Most of them need business. It's a global economy. They need to be doing business overseas to stay in business. And with the defense market starting to go down, a lot of them are losing money there, and they need to be able to do business in a timely way. It drastically impacts our industrial base, and we need to really watch that carefully.
Thank you for that. I know that there have been some movement made by other jurisdictions. Foreign Affairs Committee is languishing perhaps in the Senate. But in terms of what we as a nation need to continue to have that kind of inspiration and that kind of leadership, again, global leadership in this space exploration, your final answer would be finances and ITAR?
It would be.
Dr. Pace?
I would say that, again, maybe as the policy guy, I would say policy programs and budgets, the alignment between those. Mm-hmm. And there are a lot of disconnects between policies, programs, and budgets that we're looking at, and that's really the core of instability. I think we need to have a clear statement that we are going to be going beyond low Earth orbit and doing what the CABE said we should do. I think we should have a program to execute that ability to go beyond low Earth orbit, and I think that there is one on the books. And I think we need to fund those programs. Now, if we don't like those answers in some ways, then we have a choice. We can change our goals. We can decide to add more money, or we can decide to take on more risk. But I think that the fact that people are uncertain about what policies, programs, and budgets we're going to be implementing is the ambiguous problem that makes other countries wonder if we're going to be there as a partner. So policy stability, I guess, would be my number one, supported by the resources to carry that out.
I think what you've all answered is consistent with the recommendations from the Augustine Committee, and those are of concern to us in terms of what will be the outcome of that report and where those policies, programs, and funding will be established. So I think we're all saying the same thing. Thank you, Madam Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Cosmas. Mr. Rohrbecker.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman, and appreciate you holding this hearing. Appreciate the witnesses today, stimulating our discussion of America's space program. One thing is clear, just although the complaint that funding is a problem, something else is clear by the testimony today is that we spend more money than any other country on space. Thus, if there's a problem, it's not necessarily that the money isn't there, but the money that's being spent has not been spent wisely, and that there's been a lack of discipline and prioritization, and perhaps a lack of professionality both inside our government and in the private sector. I understand that the Ares 1 was launched recently, and I was just reading Buzz Aldrin's analysis of that, which is very interesting. I would submit that for the record at this point. And I understand that the Ares 1 actually cost us $500 million. Is that correct? Ares 1X cost us $500 million, and it was. And if you take a look at the details of exactly what it was all about, it was probably the most expensive launch that we've had for a long time, and was not really an entire, and it wasn't a rocket in and of itself. So, but let's get to the subject at hand here. When we talk about space cooperation, I personally believe that space cooperation is a prerequisite because of cost factors to future endeavors in space. We've got to have that because we can't afford to do it on our own. But in space cooperation, that doesn't necessarily mean we need to cooperate with every country in the same way. We've heard the first complaint of the witnesses today was ITAR. I've heard that. And the second was funding. But can we not cooperate with other countries like our European friends and things like space debris, which I think is a vitally important issue for us all to handle? It affects every one of our spacefaring nations, without having to have an elimination of the ITAR restrictions on dealing with vicious dictatorships like China? Can we not cooperate with the rest of the countries of the world, more democratic countries of the world, without having to lift ITAR restrictions on China? That's my question to the panel. Go right ahead.
Please, go ahead.
Well, I think that's a good question, and I think that there are a number of areas, for example, in basic science, space science and earth science, where cooperation can happen without necessarily changing the export control rule, because these were areas that we engaged with the Soviet Union during the height of the Cold War. We had science programs that went on and built relationships, and so that's kind of a careful foundation that I think could be done also with China, and maybe perhaps should be done with China. Issues of protection of spectrum, issues such as sharing information about space situational awareness, standards. These are all things where cooperation could be extended without violating current export control rules. Regulatory reforms, open trade. These are, again, are things where progress, I think, can be made. But at the end of the day, if you want to achieve the highest degree of cooperation and the degree of insight and trust that come only with flying together in space, you eventually do have to confront the ITAR regulations and the burdens they impose. But are there things that you could proceed with right now? Right. Yes, there are, and I think my colleague in the European Space Policy Institute and I have tried to speak to that.
Well, certainly when we're talking about future space endeavors, I think that China is a country that we should look at and recognize. As by the way, the Germans had tremendous technological capabilities during the 1930s, and it was probably would have been a bad idea for us to enter into cooperative relationships and have the same standard for Germany then that we had for our European, more democratic allies. And perhaps in China, until we see some reform, we could be cooperating at the level that you're talking about within ITAR, but loosen the restrictions for ITAR with our other more democratic countries. Isn't that a better strategy? Yes, sir.
Well, I think we could certainly adopt a strategy like that. One of the reasons, with respect to China, one of the reasons that I focused as an example on Latin America, I could have chosen other regions, Africa or some other areas of the world, is that we see the increasing influence of China in Latin America, specifically in the space realm. And while I think that that has certainly assisted some of those countries there to develop their space capabilities, I'm not sure we want to encourage that kind of activity with, say, Venezuela, which is extending its own influence over Latin America. So I think there are some concerns there, and by U.S. becoming a bit more involved, especially in the space realm, because there's a great interest. A number of countries are now, in Latin America, are now developing their own space policies and their own space programs. And
well, that's a good thing. Let's just note, and I know my time is up, Madam Chairman, just note for the end that a lot of this Chinese space capabilities, some of us believe that that came directly from America's irrational cooperation with the Chinese 15 years ago, in which there were major transfers of technology that have been developed by American taxpayers. We need to make sure we focus and get our money's worth and not necessarily transfer those capabilities to our adversaries and competitors. Thank you very much, Madam
Thank you,
Chairman.
Representative Rohrabacher. And also for the record, I just want to state that, the Ares 1X launch not only was highly successful, but also a very necessary key part of moving towards the Constellation program, which members of Congress have supported. And it's a new platform, new vehicle, and I, for one, am just particularly pleased with the result.
Are
of the
you
Ares
pleased
1X.
with the cost of the project for what we got out of it?
Congressman Rohrabacher, as you know, because you've certainly been the subcommittee chair in the past, that what we do as a nation with human exploration is very risky. It's very complicated. Obviously, we've not seen it replicated in many different examples by many different countries, or by individual standalone companies. And there's a cost to greatness, and I know I, for one, am willing to pay that cost. Representative Fudge.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for being here today, all the panelists. I really have just one question, actually. Mr. Pace, I believe it was your statement. You indicated that China's human spaceflight experiences are training a new generation of technical specialists and raising the quality level of industrial suppliers. I know that I sit in these hearings all the time, and most of the people I see in rooms, especially in this committee, are very young people. My staff is very young. I have people who are very interested in science. Tell me that if we continue to go forward as we have with knowing that probably at least for the next 5 years that we're not going to have any human access to space, what do we do to keep our young people engaged? What is your suggestion? What do we do to and keep our young people engaged and our supplier base capable so that as we go forward we can be where we need to be? Anyone can answer the question. I just happen to think that it was Mr. Pace that said it. Thank you.
I'll see what my colleagues suggest. I think the fundamental thing we have to do is we have to do real missions. We have to have real hardware. We can't simply have programs where we have lots of view graphs and we say how great things are going to be. They can be modest things. They could be small satellites. They could be balloons. They could be aircraft. They could be test flights, such as the Ares vehicle. They can be things that maybe take a long time. But there is a unique change that occurs when engineers see real hardware happening. You start figuring out who is actually really good in the field and who is maybe they should stick to doing view graphs. And that lack of sense of reality, where's the real hardware going to be, I think is the thing that most deters people from pursuing longer-term careers, because they don't see what's going to be built. And thank you for mentioning the Chinese case. I have to note there was just actually a nice press report this week that China had opened a 7,000 square meter plant outside Beijing that's used for design and development of their lunar exploration systems, for in-orbit management of spacecraft and analyses. They are laying the groundwork now for a very long-term effort. It may take them longer than they expect, but they have younger people coming. They're investing in the facilities. They've got a fairly logical program that's step-by-step going forward. They will do it with or without us. And again, I said we shouldn't fear them being out there, but we should worry if we're not out there with them.
Thank you. Yes.
I'd like to pick up on something Dr. Pace mentioned and add to it a bit. It's the question for engineers, scientists, to work with hardware, to work with experiments, to work with observations and so forth. So we can do a lot in those realms, even with small satellites. I teach in the International Space University from time to time, and you find there some very, very great interest in space, even when the projects are small, where they're small satellites. But the point is that the students have a chance to get their fingers dirty, soldering, the circuit boards and so forth, and actually putting together a small satellite. And it's wonderful when they work, but there's still an excitement if the project fails at some point, because they've actually had a hand in it. So I think that's very important.
Yes. Go ahead.
This afternoon, I have the pleasure of going to a commercial launch. It's my 6-year-old son at St. Stephen's. His model club, Rocket Club, is launching rockets this afternoon, and I hope that someday he participates in AIA's Team America Rocketry Challenge, which is a big event that I think you're aware of. The point I'm trying to make is that we need to get to these kids early, and we need to get them excited. And I know that the chairwoman mentioned you're going to be having a hearing on workforce and industrial base, and I know you'll talk more about it then. But I think, as been said here, we really really need to have stable funding, and we need to have policies that cross the administrations. We cannot have each president that comes up every 4 or 8 years change in the direction that we're going. We have to stick to something, because to get to the moon, to get to an asteroid, to do things is going to cross many administrations, and we can't keep on changing in the middle of the changing horses in the middle of the river.
Thank you very much. And I just want to thank all of you for your answers, and just say for the record that what I'm hearing today from a panel of experts is that it is worth the money to do what we need to do to keep us where we need to be as a nation, where we need to get young people engaged in science early. And it is worth it. Sometimes we fail, sometimes we succeed, but the dollars are necessary to keep us as the premier country in this world. So I thank you very much.
Thank you, Representative Fudge. We have noticed that votes are going to be called between 11:15 and 11:30, but I think we have time for another round with the members. So, and it's a long round of votes, so we're going to have to adjourn when the votes are called, and we have to leave. I have another couple of quick questions. Specifically, we talked about growing international capabilities and what's happening with space products in the global market. Specifically, I'd like to hear in what exact products or which types of services are we seeing increased competition? I mean, true, real competition with what we've been able to produce here in the United States. Let me start with Mr. Stevens, so that way you can't blame Mr. Hauser for taking your answers.
Well, the two issues that come to my mind are launch capability, and I mentioned that, and ComSats. These are two areas that were being undercut, and it's difficult to compete with nations that have a labor force and don't pay them what we pay people and take care of people that way. So that's very tough, and the ITAR adds to that type of thing. It makes it very difficult for us to do business with people overseas, and as I mentioned, that's why we're coming up with these, other countries are coming up with satellites where they don't have to do business with us. It makes it much easier. So.
Yeah, thank you. Other people? Dr. Pace?
Well, I think I'd like to point the launch vehicle and the communication satellite industry are the two areas where you've seen U.S. market share drop off fairly seriously over the last decade or more. And particularly in the case of space launch, one of the problems there is that there's a relatively small number of launches that are competed every year, and they're competed with other countries that have different industrial policies. In some cases, as is said, it's because of differences in what they pay people. In some cases, they're inheriting material that was left over from the Cold War. Or in other cases, the other countries have decided we're simply going to produce a certain production run of vehicles and then simply going to then make those vehicles available. So it's not a commercial market in a pure sense. It's we're going to have X numbers of vehicles, we'll produce those, we want to keep a production line open, we want to maintain a certain size industrial base, and then we will allocate those vehicles. That is not, a commercial market. And so it's really hard, I think, for private U.S. firms who are trying to compete against state enterprises or against foreign industrial policies that are there for other purposes to compete in that kind of market. It's a very hard question. I don't know that I would want to emulate or replicate that policy for the U.S., but I think it's fair to recognize that we're not competing on the same terms and conditions that other countries are. And that has an effect on our industrial base and our competitiveness, and so we have to ask, okay, now what should we do given that reality? The globalized market means not only are there more competitors in terms of products, but there are more competitors in terms of alternative policies that affect our companies.
I'm thinking about other countries that certainly have financial constraints in this day and age, just like the United States. Yet other countries, while they don't spend the dollars that we exactly spend in terms of their budgetary priorities, are making significant inroads. How is it that other global leaders or other governments are justifying to their people the benefits or the rewards or the sacrifices being made to fund new space innovation? Dr. Schrogl? Yeah.
In fact, Europe has recognized space as a lead market. The European Union has set out a number of particularly important areas for the economy, and 1 out of 6 has been space. And this was a clear signal that space does comprise a number of benefits, be it in manufacturing, but even more so in the services. And Europe wants to grow, of course, in this area. And its strategy is, in particular, also in view of Galileo as a global system, which will certainly provide a new setting and create competition, in particular also for the services which are provided and the manufacturing which is related to GPS, and where Europe intends to grow considerably. So the European governments say the economic impact of space will be raising, and it is also doing its best to make the right framework conditions on the regulatory level as well as on the policy level, which is a straightforward European space policy, to make that really become to the benefit of the people. On the other hand, I should mention that as well, the European leaders have recognized the high potential of space as a symbolic issue area, and that the prestige you can get in the international field should not be underestimated by the Europeans. So far, we haven't really went into that, but now we are recognizing it also vis-à-vis the other countries which are competitors in this field, attractiveness as a high technology partner like China or India. So Europe is putting together a whole set of arguments in order to invest in space and make it known to the public that this is money worth spent.
Interesting. Dr. Williamson.
I might add to that Europe has invested time and effort into developing a kind of strategy for its space efforts in Europe. And I think, as I mentioned in my testimony, I think it would be very helpful for the United States not just to develop policies, but also a strategy going forward to guide our space efforts. Well, one of the things that Europe and a lot of the small countries have done is focus a lot on Earth observations, services, in addition to the technology and the science. We've tended to focus more in Earth observations on the science side of it, and a lot less in the service side of it for public sector. And that's the difficulties there are enhanced or made more difficult by the fact that it's very difficult to make a shift from the science side that NASA funds into, say, for Earth observations, either U.S. Geological Survey taking over systems or NOAA taking over systems, which tend to be very expensive systems to develop and maintain. So that's one area that we could work on, it seems to me, is fixing that. I'm not sure how to do it. I know it's been around for a long time, but I feel the need to point that out once again.
Thank you, Dr. Williamson. Congressman Olson.
Well, thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. I have one question. It'll be very brief. It's for you, Dr. Pace. In your testimony, you state that the Human Spaceflight Review has, quote, created an air of uncertainty over U.S. intentions. And I'm concerned that any changes to the program at this point will extend the gap. And I know that I'm going to step into territory and I'm going to incur the wrath of my colleague from California here, but I thought the Ares 1X launch was an extremely successful launch. And my question for you is, how will any alterations of the path we have planned for the Ares 1 affect our ability as a partner, an international partner, particularly if we assume that we're going to extend the space station to 2020. We're going to have some access to it.
Well, thank you. You know, I have to say that in one area I will certainly agree with Congressman Rohrabacher in that the Ares 1 did not demonstrate brand new physics. I mean, it was an engineering achievement. It was a test achievement. It was not it's not something that you would consider technologically groundbreaking, and that's a good thing, because the shuttle program is ending, and we need to have a vehicle that we can rely on for access to space. It's time to really, I think, put aside a lot of the really pretty view graphs and make sure that the U.S. government in this nation has a capability that it's going to be able to rely on. Now, if it turns out that other commercial activities are able to take over the burden of getting to LEO, I will be thrilled. I think that will be absolutely wonderful. But the question is, I don't want to bet on that happening unless I know that I've got something else to back it up. So to me, the Ares 1 vehicle is absolutely necessary as insurance, as a way of making sure I can get to space, so I can place considered bets on the commercial community. In fact, is enabling of those bets on the commercial community. And the other thing is it helps me bring forward that capability, a strategic capability in this country for doing human spaceflight farther in the future. So it's a crucial bridge, if you will, to the future, because if it turns out that we don't have Ares 1, if it turns out that the commercial options take longer and are more expensive than maybe people expect, the result is we'll be reliant upon our ISS partners, in particular Russia. Now, Russia has been an excellent partner. If it was not for Russia after the loss of Columbia, we would not have been maintaining the station. But a strategy going forward that is willing to place maybe a decade worth of bet on relying on a foreign country for access to our facility, to me is not a great idea. I want to encourage commercial, but I want to have a backup option in case it doesn't show up on time.
Yes, sir. Thank you for those comments, Madam Chairman. I yield back my time.
Thank you, Mr. Olson. Representative Cosmas.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. I was going to ask a different question, but in light of the comments that were just made, I think it's an excellent place to round out this conversation today. I think Dr. Pace said much of what we have been saying as a committee and as a group of members who strongly support manned space exploration and the continuation of our ability to maximize the use of the International Space Station with our partners, but also to continue and look for what you all have suggested, which is policy, programs, and budgets that will work going forward and a consistency of programs. And I think we're all most interested in seeing that occur, and we appreciate your conversation with us today. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Representative Cosmas. Congressman Rohrabacher.
Well, here I am again. Let's just note that as we've progressed with this discussion, that there is no doubt in my mind that space investment is worth the money. There's no doubt about that. And I am a strong supporter of making sure that, and space cooperation is essential if we are going to achieve the potential that we have and all of humankind has in terms of utilizing space for the benefit of the people here on Earth, but also to explore in the areas beyond. But the question isn't whether or not it is worth the money. The question is, are we getting our money's worth that we're spending? We are spending more than any other country of the world, yet we're falling behind. What does that tell you? We've got to do some things better than what we're doing, and we're not going to do it by simply excusing inefficiencies when we see them. Now, let's note that in the private sector and the commercial space business, you have SpaceX out there, and from what I have seen, SpaceX has spent less money and have developed a whole new rocket system, the Falcon system. They spent, and everything that they spent is less than what the cost of a design test of Ares X that has not even tested any new hardware. Now, this test that we just had was a test of design, but not a test of hardware. But yet you have a commercial endeavor that's able to spend less money and develop a whole new rocket system. Now, we can't go on like that. What we have here is not a lack of money. We have a lack of discipline, a lack of focus, a lack of prioritization, and a lack of demand by the members of the United States Congress on more effective use of the resources that we're spending. And I would suggest that we do need to cooperate. That's one of the ways that we can maximize it, but we also have to keep in mind that when we cooperate with non-democratic countries like China, there's a payback. And in the end, it's a brutal payback for the people of the United States who have upgraded, which we did 15 years ago with our cooperation with China. We upgraded their capabilities, and now they're coming back as our competitors and our adversaries. So it seems to me that we just have to be responsible, and we have to be self-disciplined, and we have to try to be as realistic as we can. And sorry to sort of shoot that out, but maybe some of the panelists or the chairman would like to comment on that. Thank you, Madam Chair.
What a softball. I'd rather talk about the times when I went to UCLA and used to surf down at Huntington, but I guess I'll take this one on.
I never cut you off when you were down there.
I represent all companies. You mentioned SpaceX and all the companies that are building Ares 1. And I would say that having been a program manager over on the aircraft side of things, it's hard to tell exactly what the costs are and what it costs to do something these days. I would agree with you that anytime there's acquisition, there's ways to do things better, and we need to take a look at that. I don't think there's competition between companies like SpaceX and the other companies that are building Ares 1. They're two different missions. One is designed to go up in a commercial way, supply the International Space Station. The other one is already looking at human space flight, and it takes a lot of money to do that type of thing. And it's supposed to go beyond that. It will provide us a capability. And as I said earlier, I don't think we should be changing horses in the middle of the stream right now, or we'll never be able to get up there. We'll have to extend the space station to 2030 by the time we start, we get something, the government gets something to do. I hope you're right about SpaceX. They're a very good company, and I think they'll do great in the commercial world. And as I mentioned, it's good both ways to have two different systems to get up there. On the ITAR side of things, I agree with a lot of what you're saying, but it is impacting us. I think we need to take a look, as you mentioned earlier, at different countries and how we treat them. Scott mentioned that we are working with the Chinese on different things. We're members of the Global Earth Observation Systems of Systems. 80 countries are involved in that. We're sharing climate data and things like that, and that's a good thing to do. And one would think that if we had an accident of some sort up on the International Space Station and the Chinese had the capability of rescuing our astronauts, we'd like to take that into account. But we do not want to be in a position of handing over important data. And as I said earlier, the two questions you need to ask whenever you're thinking about doing cooperation with other countries is, number one, how does it impact national security? And number two, how does it impact the industrial base?
Great. Thank you, Mr. Rohrbacher. As we all know, votes have been called. I have one final question, and certainly if there's anyone else that wants a final question, please let me know. We have a few minutes here. A couple nights ago, I had the pleasure of listening to a lecture on Hubble by Dr. John Grunsfeld over at the Smithsonian. And, I mean, the images, of course, from Hubble are absolutely phenomenal, but more so than that, having spent a lot of time watching a lot of space station videos, as we all have a chance when the crews come back, and at home too, get a chance to watch some of those videos. It really, I mean, just piques the imagination there of how large the universe is, and all those questions that we have about the universe that are really unanswered. And I think it touches to this human exploration part of getting out of lower Earth orbit and moving back to the moon, and then going on and exploring this vast track of sky that we have. There's been a lot of questions, and I think as members of the subcommittee and members of Congress, we take space very seriously. But in some respect, in terms of the growth of global space capabilities, the problems and the opportunities it presents, that this also needs to be shouldered by the private sector and also by the nonprofit community, all of these NGOs out there, these groups that also have an interest in space. So I guess my final question to the panelists is that obviously you can hear a strong commitment by members of the subcommittee, the committee, and the vast majority of members of Congress. You can see that certainly in the past budgets that we have supported. But really, what's the responsibility and what are the actions that the private sector and folks out there in the nonprofit world, I mean, what are all of you willing to do to make sure that the United States continues to lead in this area? Mr. Hauser.
I'll take a first stab at it. I'd like to think we're attempting to do our job fairly well. Certainly at the Space Foundation, we have a very active education program. And based on the question earlier, I had wanted to share that we have a partnership with Charles County, Maryland, which is quite a fabulous partnership. A very forward-leaning school superintendent wanted to build a planetarium for our students, and he realized the only way to do that was to leverage it across all of the disciplines. So every grade level and every discipline has to integrate space and science into their education program, which is pretty fascinating. You find the teachers are thrilled with what they're doing because the English teacher is teaching mythology, based on space. You find can't think of the right word, but teachers about mining space, shop teachers talking about mining asteroids and things like that. So I think part of what we do is the education process. Another thing we do at Space Foundation, obviously, is come to hearings like this. We publish the space report. We thank you for the plug earlier today to help educate and inform America. And we spend a great deal of time trying to make sure that this works for not only the technical person, but, grabs my mom's interest as well, too. And then I would say that we do a lot of things to partner with industry, provide networking forums and things like that, again, to get our message out and to interest more people in space and in science and in all the things you just mentioned. So thank you for the opportunity.
Mr. Stevens?
One of the things that the Aerospace Industries Association on the space side will be doing next year is ramping up and really doing a big campaign. I think we're talking to our members about doing this right now, but we really need to focus and get the public involved. If you look back at the public approval of going to the moon, back when we did that, it was only about 40%. But if you talk to people now and you look at surveys, Gallup polls of what's going on, it's close to 77%. So people like space. They want the United States to remain a leader in space, and we just need to stay involved. We need to keep the funding stable and robust, as I mentioned. So that'd be my answer.
Thank you, Dr. Pace.
Well, I think the most important way I think we contribute at George Washington University, of course, is in the education of our people and the people over the many, many years who've come through the program. You find them all over the world. We have students who are in every space agency around the world. We have visiting scholars from all over the world. And so that there is a community that's been built up that on one hand recognizes deep differences, that other countries have their own separate objectives and interests and needs, but also the commonality that you described as we sort of look beyond our immediate needs and we recognize this broader horizon that we can be moving toward. So one of the things I think that we try to do is to try to connect space to these sort of broader interests of national security, foreign policy, economic development, international trade development, that it's not simply about a bunch of engineers having a good time with their own particular project, but it's about serving a sort of broader, really more transcendent interests in our societies. And I think that's been one of the privileges in the institute that I have, is being able to see that in generation after generation of students who've come through that program.
Thank you. Dr. Schrogl, maybe the European perspective?
Yes, indeed, Madam Chairwoman. I cannot exactly respond to your question because I'm working for the purpose of having Europe maybe in the future being a leader in outer space, at least a small leader. Now, we are trying to convey the message that space is useful for a number of policy areas. And this is, I think, a theme Scott Pace has already mentioned as well. And in Europe, it's very complicated with all the levels we have with the member states, with the European level, to also educate the decision makers that space is a tool, a powerful tool, to achieve results in these policy areas ranging from security to knowledge, mobility, resource management, and the environment in particular. And so this is one of our main tasks, to show the benefit of space and space applications in these policy areas, and of course then to try to convince the decision makers as well as all the users, the potential users, to reap the benefit from utilizing space capabilities to this extent.
Thank you. Dr. Williamson.
Well, yes, the Secure World Foundation, it's a small foundation with offices in Colorado, United States, and Vienna. We have focused heavily on space sustainability and educating people not only in the United States but also in other countries about the importance of focusing some effort on sustainability so that we reduce the issues with space debris and also with this orbital crowding that I mentioned in my testimony. One of the things we do is partner with an organization in Canada, Project Plowshares, to produce this Space Security Index every year, and which is available online and in paper copy, so that we educate people about space policies and about the importance of maintaining the space environment for all the benefits we obtain from the space environment.
Thank you. I mean, I want to thank all of our witnesses today. Any additional questions? No? No? Okay. Again, I mean, I think we covered a lot of ground, and this is something during a very difficult time of competing budget priorities that we need to continue to be vigilant about, and we need to continue to focus on. So again, for our witnesses, thank you so much for being here. Before we bring the hearing to a close, also I want to make sure that the record will remain open for 2 weeks for additional statements from the members and for answers to any follow-up questions that subcommittees members may ask of our witnesses. The witnesses are now excused, and the hearing is now adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.